Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michaela Bava. I'm an assistant curator in modern and contemporary art here at the Art Institute. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this program on the challenges conservators face preserving outdoor sculpture across the museum campus and the unique techniques they develop to address them. As we begin, a brief reminder to just please silence your cell phones. And it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this afternoon's program, Haddon Dine, an assistant objects conservator in the Department of Conservation and Science here at the Art Institute. As an objects conservator, Haddon examines, documents, treats, and researches sculptures and decorative arts in the museum's collection. Haddon holds a Master's in Science in Art Conservation from the Winterthur University of Delaware program and a BS in Chemistry from the University of Pittsburgh. She has worked or trained at a number of prestigious institutions, including the Lunder Conservation Center at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Victoria Albert Museum in London and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, just to name a few. I am extremely fortunate to work so closely with Haddon on the care and display of works in the museum's permanent collection, but also works that come to the museum for special exhibitions. This includes a project with Chicago-based artist Diane Simpson, whose work is currently on view on the museum's Bloom Family Terrace, and a project that you'll hear more about today in this afternoon's program. Now, without further delay, I'm pleased to welcome Haddon to the stage.
Thanks, Michaela. All right, so we're talking about a huge topic today. This is really too big to cover in one lecture. We could talk about this for days, but we're going to cover a lot today. I'm going to talk some about outdoor sculpture conservation generally, and a lot about specific sculptures here at the Art Institute. First, I'm just going to do a brief review of what conservation is. Conservators help guide the long-term preservation of the collection. We examine and document the art, we do preventive care, we treat objects when they need it, and we research them. Every piece of art that comes in and out of this building gets examined. We document the condition so that we can note future changes, but also so we know how things should be handled and displayed, whether they are safe to travel, and whether they need treatment. Preventive conservation covers a wide variety of non-invasive actions that can slow deterioration. Dusting, controlling temperature and relative humidity, limiting light, monitoring pest activity, and rehousing objects are all part of preventive work. There are many forces that can cause artwork to deteriorate. Some things are slowly deteriorating no matter what we do, but we aim to make that process as slow as possible. These are what we call the 10 agents of deterioration, and this is kind of a way to sum up what can damage art. We try to control these as best as we can, keep them from causing harm. Some of these are obvious physical forces. You don't want something to get knocked over. You don't want something to catch on fire. Light can fade some things, make resins cross-link and get brittle. Temperature, relative humidity, and fluctuations in both can all accelerate deterioration. Maintaining good conditions in storage and in the galleries is important. So we try to manage all of these, and when art is inside our galleries, we can actually do that. Treatment encompasses everything invasive we do to an object, so cleaning, stabilization, repair, and filling losses are all treatment. We may treat objects for several reasons. Sometimes it is because the object is going on display, and sometimes because it has become so unstable that it needs work or damage will continue and worsen. Sometimes we're cleaning an object, removing grime or old restorations, and those kinds of treatments might be very dramatic before and after. But other times we're stabilizing an object by doing something such as maybe consolidating flaking paint. And in those cases, the object might not look any different. You might not be able to tell that any work was done at all. We aim for everything we do to be reversible, or at least retreatable. Just as we may have to undo old restorations when they are discolored and degraded, someone may have to undo my work one day, hopefully very far in the future. And they need to be able to undo it without damaging the object. And some things we do aren't completely reversible, and in those cases, we aim for our work to not cause issues for future treatment. So we say retreatable instead of reversible in those cases. And conservation scientists, conservators, and curators work together to research how artists worked, what materials they used, and how those materials are aging. and this can be enlightening about an artist's practice and can also inform future care. At the Art Institute of Chicago, we have conservation departments for books, frames, objects, paintings, paper, photographs, textiles, time-based media, and conservation science. And I'm an objects conservator. Objects conservation covers kind of just anything that doesn't fall into the other categories. We treat a wide variety of materials, including inorganic materials such as ceramic, metal, glass, and stone, and organics such as ivory, leather, plant materials, and plastics. Many of the objects we work on are composite objects, including several of those materials. Sometimes they may have painted components or paper components, and we consult with our colleagues in paintings conservation, paper conservation. The Mike Kelly on the left here is arguably a textile, so we collaborate a lot. We sometimes actually joke about whether something is or isn't under certain person's purview. Here is a stuffed textile sculpture, a Meissen porcelain monkey, some wooden shell shoes, and some bananas. And here we have some chromed steel, a massive wood sculpture, and an army of fiberglass dog people. These are all things that I've worked on in the past year or two. And outdoor sculpture also falls under the purview of objects conservation. So we were just talking about controlling temperature, relative humidity, light, all of that. Now we're outside, throw all that out the window. Outside is an entirely different thing. Pretty much everything we just discussed is out of our control. Outside, the sculptures are at the mercy of the elements. All of these things here fit into the 10 agents of deterioration, but you have really the most extreme possibilities. So you've got uncontrolled water and temperature. Freezing and thawing does a lot of damage. If there's any little gap anywhere in a sculpture, water will get in there, it will freeze and expand. You have absolutely uncontrolled, unfiltered sun. The art is out there baking in it all day, every day. There's wind. A sculpture needs to be able to withstand high winds. You have pollution and grime. Some things will just deposit on the object. Others can react with the surface. You have birds. Bird poop is actually acidic. If you don't remove it quickly, it can eat away at the surface. Bugs. I've cleaned endless bug droppings. Sometimes wasps might nest in sculptures. Other animals can also be a problem. Fun anecdote, but sometimes outdoor sculpture can be made of lead, which apparently tastes sweet. And squirrels will eat it. When I worked with a conservator in Philadelphia years ago, I saw sculptures where chunks had just been completely gnawed off. There were just squirrel teeth marks in the sculpture. And the conservator I worked with would apply hot pepper wax to the sculptures to deter the squirrels. And at the end of this list, of course, we have people, which, depending on the day, I think are the most predictable or most unpredictable force of destruction. So these forces of nature differ in different regions with climate. Sculpture near the coast in Florida will experience very different things from sculptures in a desert city. You can imagine just how salty, wet air can deteriorate, say, a car. Same thing with sculptures, or imagine dry sand being blown around. Most things outside will not remain unaltered. Think about cement with rusting rebar, flaking paint on bridges. I think this is a Chicago Metro bridge. Almost nothing put outside is going to be the same forever. Anything that you'd have to worry about with any other object you're putting outside, buildings, cars, patio furniture, you have to worry about that with sculpture. All right, so let's look at some sculpture. The Art Institute has outdoor sculptures scattered around the AIC and SAIC campus. Maybe you heard the talk a couple years ago about the lions on Michigan Avenue. Here are 4 sculptures currently in the North Garden. So these are painted steel, bronze, stainless steel, and bronze. And there are currently 2 sculptures in Pritzker Garden. Pritzker Garden is the only one of the outdoor spaces that you have to have entered the museum to go see. White Curve by Ellsworth Kelly is painted aluminum, and Mended Petal by Yoko Ono is stainless steel. There are 2 sculptures in the East Garden at Columbus Drive, these granite chairs by Scott Burton, and these signs by Edgar Heap of Birds. AIC has other Scott Burton pieces in the collection. Here are 2 other chairs, and these are displayed indoors, and these also recently returned from being in a traveling Scott Burton show. These outdoor Burton chairs are actually the only one of the outdoor pieces where sitting on them is welcomed, and they're also the only outdoor collection items that we have in the garden right now. And this Edgar Heap of Birds piece is made of printed mylar and vinyl on galvanized steel, so it's basically like street sign material. We have sculptures on Bloom Terrace, which are short-term installations, and we'll focus more on that later. And through the Ferguson Monument Fund, the Art Institute of Chicago helped steward a set of 19 monuments and sculptures throughout the city of Chicago in partnership with the Parks District. All right, so you might think that anything that we put outside must be really, really durable, and that's sort of right. Some materials do last much longer outdoors than others. Stone, metal, painted metal will fare better outside than many other materials. Here, these 4 sculptures are all metal. The Calder is painted metal, the Moore and the Lee are patinated. I'm going to talk a decent amount about metal today because we have a lot of that, but really sculpture could be made out of anything. It just depends on the material, how well it will last. No matter the materials, all outdoor sculpture requires regular maintenance in order to keep them in good condition. And there are usually protective surface coatings. So on painted sculpture, that could be a baked-on paint, an epoxy, maybe something akin to car paint, and that's protecting the substrate below the paint. For unpainted metals, there's often an applied patina and then protective coatings of resin or wax, which we will come back to. Let's look at the sculpture that has been most recently added to the North Garden here. This is Sharifa, and some of what went into installing her and taking care of her. This sculpture is by Chicago-born artist Simone Lee, and the subject is the writer Sharifa Rhodes Pitts. And this piece was made in 2022. There was already another piece by Simone Lee in the Art Institute's collection, this sculpture Dunham, and that sculpture stays inside. That's made of terracotta, porcelain, raffia, steel, glass beads, epoxy, and ink. And Sharifa was installed at the end of 2024. Before that, there was this piece by Ulrich Ruckreem in the garden, and hidden underneath this sculpture was a cement pad. If the ground is not properly prepared below a sculpture, the sculpture can sink into the ground over time, and that looks bad, but it's also bad for the sculpture. So this piece had to be deinstalled before Sharifa went in. This is made up of big stacked segments of stone, and for moving big, heavy objects like this, we work with specialized external teams. Some of these blocks had cracks, so some of them had to be lifted underneath with slings, like you can see happening here. And some could be lifted using this clamp. Look closely here, because we've talked about bugs. We're about to get into some bug stuff. So here are some spider nests or egg sacs or cocoons or something. The spiders filled this crack so well that it looked like it had grout in it. So those had to be cleaned off before this went to storage. One thing that we also think about is we're always worried about pests in storage. If you're bringing something directly in from outside, it needs to have been checked and cleaned. The cement pad under the previous sculpture was reused. It was just cut down. And then Sharifa was brought in. So the sculpture has an internal steel framework that allows bolts to be connected to a steel plate, and the bolts are adhered into the cement pad below it. And this keeps the sculpture secure and also keeps it from sinking into the ground. You need drainage and airflow to prevent corrosion. On the right here, you can see she is hovering a bit above that cement pad. Another thing to think about if you have multiple kinds of metal touching, like here we have bronze with steel framework, is galvanic corrosion. So we're going to go on a quick tangent. We'll go on a lot of tangents today, but galvanic corrosion is when two metals with different electrochemical potentials are in contact, and if they end up getting wet, you have electron flow, and one will corrode and the other will be protected. And this is thought about in many other industries. Steel pipes with brass hardware, or here we have sort of the reverse of that. I think that's a copper pipe with iron hardware. Boats with parts made out of different metals, aircrafts, machinery. And this is something that is thought about when sculptures are assembled and hardware is chosen. If inappropriate hardware is chosen, it could end up corroding the sculpture around it. Sometimes this chemistry is used intentionally, and sacrificial anodes are hooked up to a sculpture and buried with the intention of them corroding while the sculpture is protected. And all of this is yet another reason for needing drainage. So we've got good drainage here. Another thing to think about when you're putting a sculpture in the gardens is sprinklers. You don't want a piece to be getting hit by a sprinkler constantly every time the sprinklers go on. If a sculpture is in the grass, fertilizer could also affect it, but we didn't have to worry about either of those things with this location here. After the sculpture was set into the pad, the gravel was spread around, hiding that concrete. And this piece was brand new when we installed it. It is made out of bronze, which is a copper alloy, so it's a mixture of metals, but mainly copper. And this dark color on the bronze is a patina. So if we talk about patina for a minute, You hear about the patina of age, patina from nature, all of that. But when it comes to a bronze sculpture like Sharifa, the patina is an intentionally created, important protective and aesthetic step. Patina is when the surface of the metal, in this case, we're talking about bronze. On top here are some bronze ingots, so that's the bare raw color of bronze up on the top. The surface is converted using the application of chemicals and heat, and this can achieve a huge range of colors, and it also creates a less reactive, more stable surface, because basically the surface is already reacted. If you put bright, polished, uncoated bronze outside, it will start turning different colors. If you've already turned it the colors you want, the surface will be more stable, longer in the face of the elements. This is a Brancusi sculpture in the collection, Golden Bird. This is a polished copper alloy, I think bronze, with no patina or coating. And every few years, this gets polished and then slowly darkens, and we polish it again. And this cycle just continues. There is no way to stop it unless we apply a protective clear coating or we seal this inside an airtight case with scavengers. This is what it looked like a few years ago before the last time it was polished. And this is happening just from controlled air at a consistent temperature and relative humidity inside our galleries. So you can imagine how dramatically this sculpture might change if it were to be left outside. It would probably turn bright green, maybe some brown, probably a lot of colors. So converting the surface of Sharifa here to this dark brown is aesthetic, but also protective. And then over that patina is a protective wax coating. Once we put something outside, the maintenance begins. During the warm months, I check this weekly and wipe off any bird droppings and grime. Spiders nest in her ears and nostrils. I remove bug cocoons. You can see leaves gathering behind her back. I remove these as best as I can because any that get trapped down behind her skirt will compost back there and hold moisture and lead to corrosion. Anything that will hold moisture will cause problems. We keep talking about that. This is another part of choosing a location when you put a sculpture outside. You have to think about whether under a tree may be more problematic, depending on what falls from it. That can even depend on the kind of tree that you're putting it under. With this routine maintenance, we can keep the sculpture looking good for a very long time. Maintenance is key for longevity and preventing bigger problems, and the main regular aspect of maintenance is cleaning. We do regular checks and spot cleaning, and then less frequent full washing. And every couple of years in the summer, the protective wax coating on this sculpture will need to be reapplied. When you're hot waxing, a torch is used to heat up the metal and wax is brushed onto the hot surface. This is then buffed to the desired shine. This is a conservator hot waxing a sculpture when she worked at McKay Lodge, which is a business that specializes in outdoor sculpture conservation. We get grime, and we also get people touching the sculpture. Probably usually kids, leaving handprints and smears. On the right here, you can see it looks like maybe someone had their hands in that red gravel and then touched the sculpture. We get shoe prints and sometimes scratches. Where we've gotten the most scratches is on her foot. I think people have been using her foot as a step, climbing up. And it might be hard to see here on the left, but there is some scratching through the wax and the patina down to bright bare metal. And you can see some shoe prints in there too. Because I'm very passionate about this, and I think people don't realize that it does harm when they climb on sculptures, I made this silly diagram to try to show you what is happening when this gets scratched. So the bronze is the solid metal of the sculpture, and then on top of that, we have the converted surface layer, the patina, and then we have the protective wax layer. When someone steps on the sculpture with little bits of gravel or grit stuck in their shoe, that can scratch the sculpture. And that cuts through everything down to the bare bronze. So this might be just a hairline scratch, but this is a blown-up view of what's happening. And then that bare reactive bronze, remember the polished golden bird, is exposed to everything, including rain, and the copper reacts. And you get corrosion products that form. So you can see here some green spots of corrosion developed. They sort of bloom up over the wax coating. So she still looks great right now. We can clean that off, but I want to show some examples of what can happen if people climb on a sculpture in the same way continuously and why we need to deter that. This is a sculpture of John Harvard, and it's a tradition to touch his shoe. I don't remember why, and it has to get repatinated every so often, and it just gets polished again by hands over and over. And this is a bronze gorilla sculpture at a zoo. The patina is worn away on the hand and nose. I think there's an interesting sort of psychological or sociological aspect to how people interact with outdoor sculpture. I think there's a general assumption that it's really hardy, it's outside, it's okay to be interacted with because it's not in an indoor gallery, just like this sculpture at the zoo. I think a lot of people equate it to things like that, but frequent interaction will wear away the carefully applied patina. And this kind of wear is an example of something that I could not fix with regular maintenance. The coatings and patina in these polished areas are just gone. And these spots on this gorilla aren't green only because they're getting touched so often that they're just constantly polished. So now we're going to talk about some examples of beyond regular maintenance. Even with regular maintenance, regular cleaning and rewaxing, the surfaces of outdoor sculpture will most likely need to be refinished someday if they're left outside indefinitely. Those sculptures with a clear coating have to get recoated. Most painted sculpture eventually needs to get repainted. This is just entirely different from indoor art. Imagine if we repainted a Twombly sculpture. We would never do that. It still isn't something to take lightly with outdoor sculpture, but no paint layer or coating lasts forever outdoors, so it's generally expected that something left outside for many, many years will likely eventually need this done. As an example, you might remember that the lions were taken away a couple of years ago for treatment by CSOS, Conservation of Sculpture and Objects Studio. All the protective coatings and patina were gone, and they had turned bright green with streaks from water and pollution. Rachel Sabino, Director of Objects and Textiles Conservation in the Conservation and Science Department here, and Andrzej Dynowski, founder of Conservation of Sculpture and Objects Studio, gave a talk on this, and there are some articles online about it. Andrzej cleaned the surface with lasers and also did a metal repair on a tail, filling an old break. So there are differences in types of repairs that we can do inside and outside. Inside, we would not do an actual welding or brazing repair like this unless absolutely necessary. If there was a break, we would probably use adhesive and then fill it and paint it and make it disappear. That would be nicely reversible, as we aim to be, but outside, repairs we do inside would get reversed by nature. Outside, the kinds of materials we can use for repairs and the philosophy of repairs differs. If we need to fill a little loss in a sculpture inside, and depending on what the sculpture is, we might even use materials that are soluble in water. And inside, those repairs will remain intact for years to come. But outside with rain and sun and huge temperature changes, you have to use much hardier materials. Hot metal repairs, welding or brazing like what was done on this tail, are very rare inside, but if something is going outside, that's really the most stable repair that can be done. This is a porcelain punch bowl that you can go see in the Applied Arts of Europe galleries right now, and there is paint on this object from treatment that I've done, and underneath that there's water-soluble filler. And if I used the same techniques outside, it would just wash away. Maybe not immediately, but it would. And here my colleague is using paint on a bronze. Same thing, this bronze is staying inside, so her work will remain indefinitely, but outside that would get worn away pretty quickly. Outside, rather than worrying about future conservators being able to reverse our repairs with ease, we are worrying about nature having too easy of a time reversing it. We've been talking a lot about metal, but there are other materials that you can't weld. And one of my colleagues, Steph Gadera, is working on doing some testing and research to figure out how best to attach a missing replacement finger to an outdoor stone object. And she's going to use epoxy. These are some of her tests on the left. Epoxy is used only in certain cases inside. We choose from a range of adhesives, but outside, epoxy is very hardy. Another colleague in the lab here, Ruthie Rolfsmeyer, has years of experience treating outdoor artist environments, including cement sculptures like the ones on the right, and she has regularly used epoxy and mortar in her work. So getting back to the end of the lion story, here is one of the lions after treatment. It's this beautiful deep green color. Knowing what shade the patina should be during a repatination requires research. Sometimes you have to consult archival photos, discussions of the artist's desired appearance of the sculpture. You consult the artist if possible, but often a repatination or recoating is happening after the artist's death, and you're consulting with the artist's estate or foundation. So here we've got this green color, but as we talked about, there's a huge array of shades and colors that can be achieved, and you wouldn't want to make something the wrong color. Here you can see a treatment done, again, by McKay Lodge Conservator in Columbus, where the object started out corroded green, just like our lions did, same starting point. And in the middle, you can see their during treatment images, where they're cleaning the surface down to bare metal. And the end result chosen was a deep brown that you can see on the right. So same starting point as the lions, but very different color that they ended up with. Conservators at the Getty have published and presented on a major treatment of a Henry Moore sculpture in their collection in the past couple years. They did a lot of research to determine what the sculpture should look like and what to use to achieve that. Here you can see some test patches they did on the left, and on the right you can see the difference between the bare cleaned bronze and a patinated area. A treatment like this is major. We try to go as long between repatinations or repaintings as possible. This is not a regular frequent thing. You're taking this sculpture down to bare metal. You're essentially removing a thin layer of the object. So try to go as long between as possible. We have a Henry Moore here at the Art Institute in the North Garden. The lighting in these images is different, but it does look like our Moore has changed a bit since the website image was taken. So potentially far in the future, we might be researching exactly what shade this should be, just like the Getty has done. And repainting a sculpture is just as complicated as repatinating, potentially more so. There are entire conferences and workshops dedicated to discussing painted outdoor sculpture. Like with a patina, you also have to know what the original intended paint color was. You need to consult the artist or the artist's foundation or representatives. You need to think about the right paint system, what primer will bond well to the aluminum, steel, whatever the substrate is. What paint will you then use over that primer? How are you going to get that paint to the exact color you need? Are you putting a clear coat over that? Should it be matte? Should it be shiny? Should it be spray applied? If you're lucky enough to have samples of the original paint, have those aged? Can you even use those to match to anymore? Sometimes people document the approved color with colorimetry so they don't have to rely on visually matching old aged samples in the future. But if you don't have any of that info, you might be doing analysis of the old paint layers to try to figure out what pigments were in it, consulting old photos, and always consulting with the proper stakeholders for the artist. This here is a Lichtenstein piece at the Getty that Getty conservators have published on, and it had at some point been completely repainted by restorers and did not match the original color. So you can see it's a lot brighter on the left. That's with the restoration paint. And the condition was poor. So after doing a lot of research and working with Lichtenstein's studio assistant, they figured out what colors it should be. And they completely stripped this down to the aluminum and repainted it with the original paint colors. You can see the results on the right. Another huge layer of complexity is added when the surface of an object is painterly, with perhaps the artist's hand involved, or someone's hand, maybe a studio assistant, rather than just a solid color. In these instances, it becomes even more important to retain the original coating, consolidating it, and touching it up rather than starting over. The giant cauldron downtown has been repainted in the past, and at some point, someday, we will need to repaint the cauldron in our gardens. And when we get to that point, we will need to work closely with the Calder Foundation to ensure the work is done in line with the artist's original execution and vision. So we haven't talked much about the cleaning of the surface that is needed before any refinishing. For metal, we saw before an example of using layers to get corrosion off the lions. Here's another image of that in the lower left. With lasers, you're choosing the laser that will work for your specific situation, and the layer of grime or corrosion that you want to remove is absorbing that energy and being ablated off the surface. In some situations, you might need to do chemical cleaning to remove corrosion, maybe use chelators, which grab metal ions. If you need to get an old deteriorated protective clear coat off or old paint, you might need to use solvents to dissolve it. In the top left here, someone is using paint stripper. In certain situations, people will blast with different abrasive media. And sometimes you can use dry ice blasting, which is in the upper right here. And this is actually pretty gentle. The thermal shock is working. The temperature change and expansion and contraction can blow a deteriorated coating off the surface without exposing the conservator to the fumes of working with solvents, which has health hazards. And steam cleaning is also used depending on the material of the sculpture. So there's someone steam cleaning in the lower right here. There are many other surface finishes and materials that we haven't touched on, but you will see gilded sculptures around the city. These have a very thin layer of actual gold leaf on them, and this is a surprisingly very durable surface treatment because gold is so inert, it lasts longer than many other protective coatings. And then this Richard Serra piece on the right is Cor-10 steel, which is a weathering steel, which is special in that it actually forms a protective stable corrosion layer, which most steel does not. All right, so now we're coming back to AIC, and we're moving locations, and we're going to talk about Bloom Terrace. So up on Bloom Terrace, there are rotating contemporary art installations. They change every 6 months, and sometimes they are fabricated just for the terrace, so site-specific. The fact that they are sometimes brand new and only for 6 months makes them often more experimental or daring when it comes to materials than when we put something out in the garden indefinitely. We've talked a lot about metal and stone, but we're going to look at some other materials now. We have discussions with the artists and fabricators about expectations for how the sculptures might change during the 6 months outside on the terrace, and we make sure we're all on the same page. Talk about what might happen with the materials, how the artist feels about that, and how we will respond. I document changes that occur, and if anything unexpected happens, then we all check back in with the artist. This picture is from a couple of years ago. There was a John Knight installation, and this was a huge picnic table made out of cedar, larger than your normal picnic table. But think of picnic tables you've seen in parks. Usually they're gray, like a silvery color, and we did expect this to fade after a few months in the sun. Here you can see how it got much lighter in the sun. On the right is the underside of the tabletop during deinstallation. It was in the shade the entire time, so it retained that red color. If you've ever left something wood or paper or textile in your window or outside, you're probably very familiar with how much color change the sun can cause on something organic. Maybe you also saw this previous installation of Iman Issa works. The white parts here are painted metal, and the other parts are metal with a clear coat or with a patina. For every Bloom Terrace installation, we work with an engineer who consults and does calculations to determine how things need to be secured to be safe in the high winds we get up on the terrace. These objects look like they are just sitting on the ground, but every single one has a hidden, specially designed plate to keep it secured. Here are some of the mounting plates. These were made by the artist's fabricator. These were secured to the terrace, and then the sculptures attached to the mounting plates without damage. This is something that has to be worked out for every installation. Sometimes what is on the terrace has previously been shown just sitting on the floor inside in a gallery, so there's sometimes creative problem solving to do. The installers, whether those are internal or external teams, are also in the discussions about this. So we have curators, conservators, artists, fabricators, installers, engineers, and other teams in the museum, registration, security, all working together to plan and execute these installations. As you might expect, I also do regular checks of the terrace, removing bird and bug droppings and checking for condition changes, sometimes wiping footprints, thankfully not often. That diagram about the scratches applies to painted sculpture too. So if you have scratches through the paint all the way down to the metal, that can cause issues, and it's very difficult to touch that up. And then on the right here, by the end of an installation, before shipping the sculptures away, a full wash is usually needed. We have a hidden hose hookup up there. I didn't mention this before, it might be obvious, but we can only really wash things when it's above freezing out, or the water will just freeze on the sculptures as we're washing. Here are just some tiny snippets of the calculations the engineers do. They do these really intense long documents entirely of math to make sure everything is good. So this is great. We aren't standing out there saying, oh, this seems like it will probably be okay. We have experts on this. And one of the questions that is part of every installation on the terrace is, how do we get the things up there? And again, we have to get creative. Sometimes sculptures are so large they have to be pushed up the ramp from across the street to get onto the terrace if they won't fit on the elevator. And occasionally they are so big they have to be craned onto the terrace, like this Nancy Rubens on the right. Also part of every review is making sure we are within weight restrictions for everything: terrace, elevator, ramp. And here are a couple more crazy images from previous terrace installations. We've got two kinds of cranes here in this one. On the terrace right now are 3 works by Diane Simpson, as Michaela mentioned. Diane Simpson is a Chicago-based artist. The Art Institute has several amazing works by her in the collection, all indoor works. The 3 terrace works are her first ever outdoor sculptures. She often works with MDF or fiberboard and wanted to use a material she was familiar with, so she chose outdoor MDF for these outdoor sculptures. Outdoor MDF is made for use on houses, so it should hold up outside, but this is an unusual use, and there are many joins. And this is the first time we've installed anything of this material outside at the Art Institute, so we all had some questions about it. MDF is made of wood fibers and resin, so it isn't the same structurally as wood. The wood fibers can still absorb moisture and swell. Her fabricator and the installers we work with all did tests where they left chunks of this material outside to see how well it would hold up, and it did well. These sculptures were assembled on site on the terrace. The artist Diane was present. And these are secured by being bolted to steel plates, which are hidden inside the bases of the sculptures. So here are 2 of the plates before installation. We talked about how an engineer is consulted for every installation. This was the method that was settled on as a way to secure these sculptures without altering the artist's design. Here are the plates getting moved into position using a gantry. These are too heavy to just lift by hand. It was difficult to even get these up onto the terrace. And here you can see the bolts securing the sculpture to the steel. This is all hidden inside the platforms, which are part of the sculptures. The bases were sealed up, and you don't see any of that. This was all planned during the initial design phases, and it doesn't change the appearance of the sculptures at all. These sculptures are hand-painted by the artist, so she was here to touch up the areas after the bases were sealed up. And if you haven't seen the Diane Simpson sculptures, go see them before they come down in April. They almost feel like optical illusions or renderings. She's playing with light and perspective. They have weathered rain and the snow and ice this winter, which hopefully we've seen the end of that. And then in May, we will have a new exhibition on the terrace by Edgar Collell, which I can't show you photos of because it isn't here yet, but it's going to be very cool. So you'll have to come see that. And I hope when you look at outdoor sculpture, maybe you'll think about the collaborative effort that went into getting it in place. Think about the materials and how you think they will hold up over time. While they are durable, in some ways they can be surprisingly fragile, more than you might think. And they are not a sort of set it and forget about it situation. The more outdoor sculpture that you have in a garden or a campus or a city, the more work it is to maintain it. I love coming across outdoor sculpture unexpectedly out in the city. I love that there's so much of it here in Chicago. And I do often end up thinking about the likely years of discussions that went into it ending up there, the strategizing, engineering reviews, and the constant care. So I hope this gives an appreciation rather than me ruining anything for you. Thank you. So we have some time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a staff member will bring a microphone to you.
Have one right at the top here. Thank you, amazing talk. How do you think people in the past with all this old stuff that's here, how do you think they did it to keep it so we can see it now?
Do you mean mostly like stone
Like
things?
the vessels that are here and yes, the stonework, the noses are off. How do you think they did it?
So a lot of vessels were maybe inside. A lot of really ancient small objects may have been buried. If we're talking about buildings, there are a lot of buildings around the world that are ancient. They're still there. Stone is one of the most stable things, so it's going to get worn by wind. If there are cracks in it, chunks will come off. But there are some things out there that, yes, will stay there. Their appearance will alter a lot more slowly. Metal, too, will stay there. The surface finish will change. The color will change, but it's not going to fall apart after a few years. It will just look maybe not the way the artist intended. But yeah, I guess if we're talking about really old stuff, I'm thinking that stone holds up very well. I don't know if that answers the question well enough.
We've got another one up top here.
Thanks.
Hello, and thank you for the talk. One question that came to mind as you were talking specifically about the Calder over at Federal Plaza, along with the Miro, the Calatrava, and the Picasso, when you're dealing with large-scale art, and I noticed like the Richard Serra is another good example, are you affiliated with the foundations and are you working with them to do restorative work on those large-scale pieces, or do they come into the Art Institute, use the small replicas you have to plan that restoration?
It's a good question. I haven't been involved at all of treatment of any of the city pieces. So there are certain things around the city that the Art Institute helps steward in partnership with the Parks District and working with CSOS, but it's not everything in the city. So I haven't been involved in any of those. As far as working with the foundation, anytime whoever is undertaking those, they will be working with the foundation. So if that's the city treating a city sculpture, if it's us treating a sculpture, anyone anywhere across the country, if they undertake work on a sculpture, will be consulting the appropriate artist stakeholders. But yeah, and the size, depending on the size, It would depend on the situation, I think, whether something could happen in place or whether it would need to be removed and taken to a facility to be treated.
We have a
Thanks.
question over here.
Hi, really fascinating talk. And I was wondering when you were talking about the reactive metals, if you've ever encountered, and then what would you do if the artist had no idea that, oh, that's going to be a problem down the road? And then how do you deal with that without, I mean, especially like, what if it was on view, part of the work itself, and not knowing that in 10, 20 years, that's going to just, one's going to eat the others, so to speak. How do you deal with that?
So discussing with the artist their materials is an ethical aspect of a lot of conservation, also not even just outdoor art, because you don't necessarily want to be influencing an artist. But if there's an opportunity to have discussions about how we think something may fare, may age, and get the artist's opinion on that, that would be ideal. If it's already installed and they didn't know that, and something bad is happening, we could talk to them about would they be comfortable with a change happening, or if, say, it gets to the point where it needs repair, maybe they'd be happy to have that fixed. So it kind of depends on what stage you're at and how much discussion is happening. And I think that's sort of a broad answer. But yeah, a lot of the time, yeah, you're observing that later on. The artist didn't know. They might say, oh, I didn't know that was going to happen. Yes, let's remedy that. Other times, maybe you're all discussing in the planning phase for something, and then different parties can point out different points of concern. If the artist is really, I mean, defer to the artist's desire. So if maybe an artist really wants to use these types of metal and they say, yes, I hear you, but we're going to do this anyway. I know it's going to be a problem. Okay, we're all on the same page at least. So.
Got a question in the middle here.
Hi, I was wondering about the lack of architectural or physical or visual cues that prevent one from interacting with that sculpture or any of them out in the garden. For example, this one's almost inviting and it's got a relaxed posture and you want to put your hands on it. Did the artist not want anything around it or a pedestal? How does that happen? Because we're going to touch that, or some people will. It's so inviting.
That's a good question. So sometimes there are opportunities to sort of use landscaping as a gentle barrier. Not always. I actually don't know the artist's exact intentions about whether a barrier or not. I know I think didn't want like a stanchion, but yes. I mean, I personally, from my perspective, would love if everything was completely untouchable. I know that's not always possible and it ruins the artist's vision, but we do have those discussions and try to, whenever possible, create sort of these soft deterrents. If something has some shrubbery around it, maybe people are less likely to run up to it. That would be ideal, but it's not always possible. So yes, we are thinking about that. Thank you.
Question right up here.
What kind of university preparation prepares you the best for this kind of work?
So a lot of conservators have a master's in art conservation. That's common, and some training is needed before that, before you apply to the program. And then there are internships, fellowships, almost like related to sort of apprenticeships a long time ago. But outdoor sculpture conservation is also sort of its own specialization. I mean, there are people who are repatenting and recoding all the time. So we contract specialists when we need to do that kind of work. I'm doing a lot of work on things inside and outside, and I can do the regular maintenance. But there are people who end up more specialized and more trained in different aspects of conservation, because objects conservation is so broad. So,
Got another question over here.
Few years ago, there was a Agam sculpture at the corner across from the Cultural Center in Michigan and Randolph. And it needed to be repaired, redone. And there was, if I remember correctly, a difference of opinion as to how it would be done and the foundation originally. And I think they ended up just taking it down because they couldn't come to an agreement. Have you ever run into a problem where you go to conserve or repair and the foundation or whoever is now in charge has simply said, no, you can't do it? Or
I-
required you to do it in such a way that you felt was impossible?
I haven't personally run into that, thankfully, in my own work. We do definitely I work with an artist foundation representative's estate, whoever that is, and take into account their requirements and wishes. So we wouldn't go against that. I think if that happened, we would have a discussion about why we were recommending something else. I'm sorry, I don't know the specific sculpture you're talking about, but that is a possibility, yes. But I haven't dealt with it personally.
You mentioned a gap with this particular sculpture, the Simone Lee, between the bottom of the sculpture and the base.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed that you were saying that that's a common way of installing, or it's an important part of the installation. Yet that's not something that I've observed. And I feel like I've looked at a lot of outdoor bronzes. Can you just talk a little bit about how that's accomplished and why it's maybe not visible?
Yes. Thank you. So in that case, gravel was then brought up to sort of bring up almost to level, so it doesn't really look like there's a gap. I think the photo with the gap was before more gravel had been brought in. So there's airflow and there's drainage, but there's not. It doesn't look like the sculpture is hovering. So whenever possible, that is what we're trying to achieve. It's better if something's not sitting in wet soil. Sometimes it has to be. Every sculpture has sort of a different structure for installing it. But if possible, we don't want the metal of the sculpture itself sunk into soil. It could have gravel brought up to look like it's sitting on the ground. I'm trying to think of other examples. But yeah, a lot of things are attached to pylons or something that's down into the ground, and you can't see any of that so that it doesn't sink deeper. And other materials, it's okay. Like we were talking about stone, that's not as bad if that's sitting directly on the ground. There are also instances where I've seen sculptures where like the lower portion has been encased in epoxy or something like that because it was in contact with the ground and they were trying to create a barrier. So some of what you're seeing may be illusion and some maybe it is directly on the ground. Thanks.
We have a question over here.
Using this as an example, I know you mentioned you check on these maybe once a week, but when there's more adverse or like extreme weather coming, do you ever do any preventative, conservation? And do you, kind of do that more often when you know there's going to be some extreme weather conditions coming?
That's a good question. I don't think anything here, we do anything preventive if there's anything coming. Everything has been reviewed to where we know it should be okay in high winds. There are some places where I think in maybe other parts of the country, certain things get covered, I think. I don't know much about that. I haven't dealt with it, but I've seen it. So probably that might be a climate, if you're in a region where you're getting more damaging things that you can take actions against. But here in our regular weather, even in high winds or snow or ice, they'll be okay. But we do sometimes go check on them right after if we know it's been crazy outside.
Got one in the middle.
What about sculpture that's like part of a fountain? And I'm thinking particularly of the Great Lakes over here. What do you have to do just because there's constantly water running through it?
That is a very good question. I wondered if someone was going to ask that. I have not worked on fountains. I think that comes back to I would need to go to a specialist, someone who works on that all the time, because that is absolutely probably one of the most difficult scenarios. There's just water constantly. So I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. My excuse is we have to be a bit of a jack of all trades. And I often have to consult the literature or call colleagues, especially if something even comes across my bench inside that I haven't worked on in a few years. What's the latest treatment? What's the research out there? But fountains, yes, that is a tricky one. But there are people out there who regularly work on fountains. They need a lot of work to keep them looking a certain way. Good question. Sorry that I don't have more of an answer.
One more way over here.
How do you get bird droppings off of Corten steel? And are there other issues with Corten steel other than just drainage?
So bird droppings, I'm usually just using water. If I have to and if the surface could handle it, maybe I'd use a brush, but I'm usually just out there with rags and water. I mean, some surfactants, some soaps are okay too, but generally, yeah, just water. And if it was a rough surface, a brush. Corten steel, the main thing I think of is drainage. So if you've got it hovering enough or not sunk into the ground, also just the way that a sculpture is formed, if it naturally creates areas that will hold water, that can be an issue. Oftentimes that's thought about and there will be drainage holes added because you don't want the sculpture sort of creating a bowl that holds water. You'll get issues in those areas. So ideally that's been figured out and there will be drainage holes built into the sculpture in addition to thinking about drainage when you put it in the ground.
We'll take a final question at the top here.
Great talk. Thanks again for taking all the questions. And I had also a question about birds. I know there was an issue with like the Noguchi fountain. It's kind of it was by the school there, and it was. We're talking about protecting the statues from the birds sculptures. I'm wondering the other way around. At what point, if there's like an issue with a work of art that's like killing a lot of wildlife, how that's addressed. I believe they may have drained it at times, but I can't remember what actually happened with that case.
I don't know the story of that. I'm sorry. There are issues in the other, like if there's protective birds or something like that and you need to leave them, then yes, the birds maybe end up being prioritized. I don't know. Actually, I haven't dealt with a situation where we had to choose the birds and the sculpture between. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the story on that one. None of the ones I've worked on have been killing birds, but that I've seen. I have worked at a museum, which I will not say which one, that had glass walls in the garden that were killing birds, and I had to clean dead birds off of the sculptures, but that was not the sculpture's fault.
It's quite a note to end on. Thank you so much, Haddon.
Thank you.